In 2014, the president of a tiny Pacific nation you've probably never heard of made a decision that had never been made by any government in human history. He bought land in another country, 5,500 acres, more than 2,000 kilometers away, purchased outright for $8.77 million, specifically because he believed his own nation's territory was going to disappear beneath the ocean within his own citizens' lifetimes. That's not the shocking part. The shocking part is what happened next. A decade later, that land has sat almost entirely unused. Not a single citizen was ever formally relocated there. And the government, now in power in that same country, has spent the years since publicly rejecting the very premise. The purchase was built on insisting, in the words of the current president, that the whole idea of his nation sinking beneath the sea is a misleading and pessimistic scenario that his government has decided to simply put aside. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. What actually happened to a country that bought a literal escape plan from the ocean and then changed its mind about whether it needed one? And here's the harder question underneath that. Is the government now downplaying the danger because the danger was overstated in the first place, or because acknowledging it has become, for entirely different reasons, politically and economically inconvenient? This is the story of Kiribati, the Republic of Kiribati, and its strange, unfinished, genuinely bizarre relationship with a piece of land in Fiji that was supposed to save its people, and now sits mostly forgotten at the center of a much bigger geopolitical story nobody saw coming when the deal was first signed. If this kind of deep, surprising investigation is what you're here for, hit like and subscribe right now, because this story gets far stranger than the headline, "Sinking Nation Buys Land Abroad," usually lets on. To understand why any government would take a step this unprecedented, you first need to understand just how precarious Kiribati's geography actually is. Kiribati is made up of 33 coral atolls and reef islands, scattered across roughly 3.5 million square kilometers of the central Pacific Ocean, an area of open water larger than India, containing a total land area of just 810 square kilometers, smaller than many single cities. None of Kiribati's islands rises more than a few meters above sea level at their highest point. The nation straddles the equator. Its roughly 130,000 citizens live spread across islands so thin and low-lying that, in places, you can stand at the center of one and see ocean on both sides simultaneously. This isn't a hypothetical vulnerability. Kiribati has already experienced tangible, measurable effects from rising seas and changing ocean patterns. Coastal erosion eating away at village land, saltwater intrusion contaminating freshwater supplies and agricultural soil, and increasingly severe storms accelerating shoreline loss. Villagers on some of Kiribati's outer islands have already been forced to abandon settlements as seawater encroached on homes that had stood for generations. In 2007, one Kiribati citizen became the first person in the world to formally seek refugee status specifically on the grounds of climate change, a claim New Zealand's government ultimately denied, but one that captured in a single legal case the reality Kiribati's leadership was grappling with. Ask yourself what it would take for a national leader to conclude that relocating his entire population might genuinely become necessary within a matter of decades. For President Anote Tong, who led Kiribati for 12 years beginning in 2003, that conclusion wasn't rhetorical. It was, in his own words, the last resort. And it led directly to one of the most unusual real estate transactions any government has ever completed. Consider the scale of what Tong was actually confronting as a head of state. Kiribati's capital, Tarawa, is a narrow chain of islets, curving around a lagoon, home to the largest concentration of the country's population, crowded onto a strip of land in some places barely wide enough for a single road. There is nowhere meaningfully higher to retreat to within the country's own borders, no interior highlands, no elevated plateau, nothing resembling the kind of internal relocation option available to larger, geographically varied nations facing coastal flooding. When Tong warned that his country's battle against the rising ocean was one it would ultimately lose, he wasn't describing a distant hypothetical. He was describing the fundamental geographic ceiling on every domestic adaptation option available to him. Consider what daily life on Kiribati's atolls actually looks like against this backdrop. Tarawa, the administrative center and home to the largest concentration of the country's population, is a thin curve of islets wrapped around a lagoon, in places barely wide, enough to fit a single road between the ocean on one side and the lagoon on the other. Freshwater on atolls like this comes primarily from a thin lens of rainwater sitting above denser seawater underground, a lens that saltwater intrusion, driven by rising seas and storm surges, can contaminate permanently in a matter of hours. Claire Antarea, a social worker from Kiribati, captured the sense of helplessness many islanders felt watching international climate negotiations drag on, without resolution. My gosh, this is not fair. If the world can't stop the glacier collapse, who will save my people and my country? Before we get into exactly how that transaction happened and what it was actually supposed to accomplish, subscribe now, because the specifics of this deal are far more calculated and far more revealing than a simple panic purchase. Let's keep going. President Tong's guiding philosophy for confronting Kiribati's existential threat had a specific name: migration with dignity. The core idea was straightforward, even if the implications were extraordinary. If Kiribati's population was eventually going to have to leave, Tong wanted that departure to happen on his citizens' own terms. Gradually, with skills and employment already secured, integrating into a new society as contributing residents, rather than arriving suddenly as stateless refugees with nothing. "We don't want 100,000 people from Kiribati coming to Fiji in one go," Tong told Fijian state television during the negotiations. "They need to find employment, not as refugees, but as immigrant people with skills to offer, people who have a place in the community, people who will not be seen as second-class citizens." In pursuit of that vision, Kiribati's government spent roughly 2 years negotiating the purchase of the Ngātahuavatu estate, 5,500 acres of freehold land on Vanuatu, Fiji's second-largest island, roughly 2,000 kilometers from Kiribati itself. The land was owned by the Church of England, a rare piece of privately held freehold property in a country where the vast majority of land remains under customary tribal ownership and is legally unavailable for purchase by outsiders, including by foreign governments. In May 2014, Tong finalized the purchase for 9.3 million Australian dollars, roughly $8.77 million US at the time. The plan, as originally described, was multi-purposed. Some of the land would be developed into farmland, growing food to export back to Kiribati and help address the nation's chronic food security challenges. Some of it would potentially house a small initial population of Kiribati citizens. Early estimates suggested perhaps 500 people to start, engaged in agriculture and infrastructure work. And crucially, part of the plan involved bringing barges to Vanuatu specifically to extract landfill material that could be shipped back to Kiribati's own atolls to help reinforce them against the rising sea in the meantime. Fiji's own president at the time, Ratu Epeli-Nailatikau, publicly assured Kiribati's people that they would have a home in Fiji in a worst-case scenario, declaring that if the islands became uninhabitable, you will not be refugees. Ask yourself what it means that Kiribati was the only atoll nation in the world to ever take this specific step. Not just discussing climate relocation in the abstract, the way many vulnerable nations have, but actually completing a legal, binding land purchase specifically designed to enable it. Development researchers studying the deal have noted just how rare the underlying legal structure was to begin with. Because so much of Fiji's land remains under customary tribal ownership, unavailable for sale to any outside party, including foreign governments, the Ngātahuavatu estate's freehold status, a legacy of colonial-era land arrangements dating back to when the property was known as Sandalwood Island, was one of only a handful of parcels in the entire country where a transaction like this was even legally possible in the first place. Tong himself, in later interviews, described the purchase in explicitly pragmatic, almost investment-grade terms, rather than purely as an emergency measure. "With sea level rise, the value of land will go up," he told Reuters during a stopover in Norway on his way to a UN climate summit, adding that he viewed property as posing the least risk compared to other ways a small, vulnerable nation might try to preserve wealth or options for its people. He even floated the idea of Kiribati purchasing additional land in Australia or New Zealand down the line, following the same logic. It was, in other words, not simply a desperate government throwing money at an unsolvable problem, but a head of state trying to apply a genuinely rational hedge against a slow-moving catastrophe he believed the rest of the world was not moving fast enough to prevent. The negotiations themselves reveal just how seriously Tong's government pursued the deal. Colin Saibury, chairman of Fiji's Real Estate Agents Licensing Board, who helped facilitate discussions between Kiribati officials and the Fijian landowner, described spending roughly a year working on the arrangement on Kiribati's behalf. Early proposals floated even larger figures. Tong had initially been in talks to acquire up to 23 square kilometers, nearly double what was eventually purchased, with additional stated goals including establishing farms to produce vegetables, fruit, and meat for direct export back to Kiribati. Tong was explicit that the purchase wasn't only about eventual relocation. It was also a hedge against a simpler, more immediate problem, land itself becoming more valuable and scarce as climate. Pressures mounted across the region. With sea level rise, the value of land will go up, Tong told Reuters in 2014, explaining his reasoning for wanting to acquire more property abroad beyond just the Fiji purchase. Property poses the least risk, he added, when asked why land specifically, rather than other forms of investment, made sense as a national hedge against an uncertain future. Here is where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn. A decade after the purchase was completed, the land had, by most independent accounts, gone almost entirely unused for the purpose it was bought for. The agricultural development plans never materialized at meaningful scale. No barges ever extracted landfill for shipment back to Kiribati's eroding shorelines. No population of Kiribati citizens was ever formally relocated to live and work on the estate. The forested land largely sat as it had before the purchase, owned by the Kiribati government on paper, but functionally dormant. Ask yourself what happened to the sense of urgency that drove the original purchase. Part of the answer is straightforward. Implementing a plan this ambitious, relocating skilled workers, building agricultural infrastructure from scratch, coordinating landfill extraction and shipping logistics across 2,000 kilometers of open ocean, was always going to be enormously complex and expensive, well beyond the cost of the land purchase itself. Small island nations with limited government budgets and administrative capacity often struggle to execute infrastructure projects at this scale, even when the underlying urgency is universally agreed upon. But the deeper reason the plan stalled has less to do with logistics and far more to do with politics. In 2016, Anote Tong lost Kiribati's presidential election. His successor, Teneti Mamo, arrived in office with a fundamentally different vision for how Kiribati should respond to its climate predicament, and that shift changed the entire trajectory of the story. There's a particular irony in how this played out that deserves its own moment of attention. The land itself didn't change. The scientific projections about sea level rise facing Kiribati's atolls didn't fundamentally change either. At least, not in the space of the 2 years between Tong leaving office and Mamo taking a public stance against his predecessor's framing. What changed was who sat in the president's office, and how that individual chose to interpret the same underlying body of evidence filtered through a very different political and diplomatic strategy. A national asset purchased under one worldview simply sat waiting, undisturbed, for an entirely different worldview to eventually decide what to do with it. If you're wondering how a new government can simply abandon a multi-million-dollar national survival plan, subscribe now, because the political reversal that happened next is honestly one of the most surprising parts of this entire story. Let's keep going. President Teneti Mamo took a position on Kiribati's climate future that directly contradicted the premise his predecessor had spent over a decade building policy around. Speaking to world leaders ahead of the COP23 climate talks in Germany in 2017, Mamo declared, "My government has decided to put aside the misleading and pessimistic scenario of a sinking nation and has replaced it with a bold scenario." Rather than preparing for eventual relocation, Mamo's government committed to a strategy of staying and fortifying, investing in raising land elevation in Tarawa, Kiribati's main population center, through dredging projects, alongside a broader economic development plan called the Kiribati Vision for 20 years, emphasizing tourism, fisheries, and foreign investment rather than migration planning. To be precise about Mamo's actual position, he has not denied that climate change is real or that it poses genuine risks to Kiribati. His stated view leans instead on the belief that Kiribati's fate ultimately rests with what he has described as divine will, rather than being a foregone, purely mechanical outcome of sea-level projections. A fundamentally different philosophical starting point than Tong's explicit planning for eventual departure, and alongside that ideological shift came an even more consequential geopolitical one. In 2019, Kiribati switched its diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, a decision that has reshaped nearly every aspect of the country's international relationships since. By 2021, reports emerged that Kiribati intended to develop the previously dormant Ngātaawavatu land in Fiji into commercial agricultural land, specifically with what was described as technical assistance from China, repurposing the very land originally bought as an emergency climate refuge into an economic development project aligned with Kiribati's new primary foreign partner. Chinese assistance has since extended well beyond agriculture. China has helped revamp a World War II-era airstrip on Kiribati's Canton Island, a location less than 3,000 kilometers from both Hawaii and the major U.S. military installation at Kwajalein Atoll. And, as of early 2025, Chinese police have begun assisting with Kiribati's community policing and IT infrastructure, a level of security cooperation that has drawn explicit concern from both Australia and the United States regarding Kiribati's long-term sovereignty and regional strategic balance. Ask yourself what it means that a piece of land purchased to save a nation from the ocean has become, a decade later, a small but genuine data point in a much larger contest for influence across the entire Pacific. Kiribati's exclusive economic zone spans an enormous stretch of the Pacific, including the 408th 250 square kilometer Phoenix Islands protected area, one of the largest marine reserves on the planet, and its geographic position, straddling the equator across a vast expanse of ocean, makes it strategically significant to any power thinking in terms of long-range maritime influence, regardless of how few people actually live there. Kiribati's opposition politicians have publicly alleged that Beijing's growing influence played a direct role in the country's decision to withdraw from the Pacific Islands Forum, the region's primary multilateral body. In 2022, an allegation the Mau Mau government has denied, though the country's exit prompted enough regional concern that Fiji's own prime minister made a personal visit to Kiribati specifically to try to mend relations shortly afterward. The scale of Kiribati's diplomatic reorientation toward Beijing is worth understanding in full. Since the 2019 switch, China has become one of Kiribati's most visible development partners, with Chinese officials and state media consistently framing the relationship in terms of mutual respect and South-South cooperation, explicitly contrasting it with what Beijing describes as the unfulfilled climate finance promises of wealthier, historically industrialized nations. In May 2025, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met directly with Mau Mau in Xiamen, pledging continued Chinese assistance specifically on climate change adaptation within the framework of South-South cooperation, alongside expanded cooperation on marine resource protection and development under what the two governments have branded a Blue Partnership. Mau Mau won a third and final term in October 2024 with roughly 55% of the vote, a result widely interpreted by regional analysts as, among other things, a continuation mandate for his China-forward foreign policy, even as it continued to draw pointed concern from Australia, New Zealand, and the United States regarding the long-term strategic implications for a region historically considered within the Western security orbit. There's a fascinating comparison waiting just ahead, because Kiribati isn't the only vulnerable Pacific nation making high-stakes decisions about its future right now, and the neighboring approach looks almost nothing like this one. Subscribe if you want that comparison, because it puts everything we've covered so far in much sharper focus. Kiribati's reversal looks even more striking when placed beside the approach taken by its Pacific neighbor Tuvalu, which is facing an extremely similar sea level threat and has chosen an almost completely opposite public strategy. Rather than downplaying the risk of national disappearance, Tuvalu's government has leaned directly into planning for it. In 2023, Tuvalu signed a landmark treaty with Australia, the Filipili Union, a formal, legally binding agreement guaranteeing Tuvaluan citizens the right to migrate to Australia as climate conditions deteriorate, while explicitly committing Australia to continue recognizing Tuvalu's statehood and sovereignty, even if its physical territory eventually becomes uninhabitable. In 2025, more than 90% of Tuvalu's entire population applied for the visa scheme created under that treaty. Tuvalu's government has gone further still, digitizing the nation's land, culture, and history into a virtual archive, specifically so that something of the country survives, even if the physical islands do not. Two Pacific nations. Extremely similar geography, extremely similar sea level risk according to the same body of international climate science, and two almost diametrically opposed public strategies. One openly planning for departure and building international legal infrastructure to support it, the other explicitly rejecting that framing and betting instead on fortification, foreign investment, and a closer relationship with a rising global power. Ask yourself which approach you'd trust more if you were an ordinary citizen of either country, watching your own government. Make this bet on your behalf, with consequences that may not become fully clear for another generation. Before we get to how this story actually resolves, because there's a genuine scientific dimension underneath all the politics that deserves real attention, subscribe now, because the honest answer about Kiribati's actual physical risk is more complicated than either government's public messaging fully captures. Here's where this story resists a clean, satisfying conclusion, because the underlying scientific reality sits somewhere between the two political narratives, rather than clearly validating either one. International climate science, including projections published by NASA and the United Nations, continues to classify low-lying Pacific atoll nations, Kiribati included, among the most existentially vulnerable countries on Earth to sea level rise, with multiple peer-reviewed studies projecting significant land loss across the region over the coming decades, under most emission scenarios. Some more recent geological research, however, has documented a genuinely more complicated picture than a simple, uniform sinking narrative. Certain low-lying reef islands, including some in Kiribati and neighboring nations, have been found in specific studies to be naturally accumulating sediment and, in some cases, growing in land area even as sea levels rise around them through natural coral and sediment processes that can, under the right conditions, partially offset inundation. That research has been seized on by skeptics of the sinking nation framing as evidence the threat has been overstated, while the scientists who conducted the original studies have generally cautioned that this natural resilience has real limits. varies enormously island by island and does not remotely guarantee long-term habitability if sea level rise continues to accelerate as current trends suggest. Ask yourself how a small island government is supposed to make a rational, defensible, long-term policy decision in the middle of that genuine scientific uncertainty, while simultaneously navigating an intense geopolitical contest between global powers who are each explicitly courting Kiribati's loyalty with aid, infrastructure, and security cooperation, none of it disconnected from the climate question itself. It's entirely possible that Mau Mau's fortification strategy reflects a genuine, good faith reading of the more optimistic end of the scientific literature. It's also entirely possible that abandoning the sinking nation narrative has proven diplomatically and economically convenient for a government now deeply enmeshed with a foreign partner more interested in fisheries access, airstrips, and security cooperation than in funding an orderly, dignified national relocation. So here's what actually remains of Kiribati's extraordinary, unprecedented land purchase, a decade on. A 5,500-acre estate in Fiji, bought for $877 million by a government that no longer holds power, under a policy framework the current government has explicitly rejected, now being repurposed for commercial agriculture with assistance from a global power whose broader strategic interest in the Pacific extends well beyond one small nation's climate resilience. The original vision, skilled workers gradually relocating with dignity, barges shipping landfill back to reinforce Kiribati's eroding shores, a genuine backup homeland waiting in reserve, never materialized in any of the ways President Tong originally described. None of this definitively proves either government was wrong. Tong's purchase may yet prove prescient if sea level rise accelerates as most climate models still project, leaving Kiribati with an asset few other vulnerable nations possess. Mau Mau's fortification strategy may yet succeed in keeping Kiribati's islands habitable for generations, vindicating a bet that his predecessor's own approach was overly fatalistic. What the story genuinely demonstrates, regardless of which government eventually turns out to be right, is how difficult it is to separate existential environmental planning from the ordinary, messy realities of domestic politics, foreign policy realignment, and the sheer logistical difficulty of executing a plan this ambitious, even once the land itself has already been paid for in full. There's also a broader lesson here for every other low-lying nation currently watching both Kiribati and Tuvalu from the outside, trying to decide which model to follow. A land purchase, a migration treaty, a fortification and dredging program. None of these approaches is inherently more responsible or more reckless than the others in the abstract. Each one represents a different bet about the pace of a genuinely uncertain physical process, filtered through the specific political incentives, foreign alliances, and available resources of whichever government happens to be in power at the moment the decision gets made. Kiribati's own experience over the past decade is itself the clearest possible illustration of how much that calculation can change with a single election. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you were a citizen of Kiribati today, watching your government's own position on your nation's survival completely reverse within a single election cycle, which version would you actually plan your own future around? And would you trust either government enough to bet your family's home on their answer? If this gave you a far more complicated, far more human picture of what buying land because you're sinking actually looks like in practice, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which approach you think makes more sense, Kiribati's fortification bet or Tuvalu's migration treaty next door. I want to know what you think.